Well, as we mentioned earlier, we're going to be continuing today our series in Luke's Gospel, and today we come to Luke chapter 9, verses 1 to 9, under the title of Learning to Fly. And let me straight away give you a little bit of a roadmap for today of where we're going to be going. So first of all, we're going to look at that Jesus followers need training. And that's going to be the longest section, so don't worry if we're heading towards 11:30. With that, the other sections are going to be shorter than that. The second one is that Jesus' followers need to trust God, from verse 3. And then we're going to look at Jesus' followers will face rejection, from verses 4 to 5. And finally, that Jesus's followers are on the winning side. So that's where we're heading this morning, and let's move straight away on to our first point. Jesus followers need training. Doing something for the first time on your own is pretty tough, isn't it? And we've got three illustrations this morning of people or animals doing something for the first time. What you see here is a little fledgling bird going out of the nest. I wonder if you've thought about it, about how tough it must be to make that decision of when you're ready to go. You know, I can imagine a bird getting to the edge of the nest one day and saying, yeah, I think I'm ready to go. I'll go for it now. And then stepping back and thinking, ooh, no, there's that cat underneath there. And I'm not just sure if these wings will do it. I asked our next door neighbour, actually Prue, the other day, who's a bit of a bird twitcher, and I asked her, well, how do they know when it's ready to fly? And she says it's easy. The mum and dad stop feeding them. So it's fly or die. Well, here's the second picture now of an example of somebody perhaps doing something for the first time. Some of you will know Joe Bennett, who works with Young Life. Some time ago, he asked our daughter Hannah, at very, very short notice, could you take some people from YL over to an event in Harrogate? And she said, yeah, she would. It was a dark night. She didn't know where she was going, so she was having to follow Joe there, but it went fine. The journey went quite smoothly. And at the end of the journey, one of the girls who was with her, who she'd taken, said, "Oh, that was great, Hannah. I knew you'd been learning to drive, but when did you pass your test?" And Hannah looked at her watch and said, "Oh, about 6 hours ago." So that was her first drive, not, if you like, as a learner. But some people aren't too confident about it, and they like to have, instead of their L plate, they have a P plate there on their car, and that says to people, doesn't it, okay, you know, I've passed my test, but I'm still pretty new at this. I'm still learning, you know, have a bit of patience with me. Now, before we put the third picture up, can I suggest that perhaps parents might like to just put their hands over their children's eyes, and I'm going to leave it up to you with parental guidance as to whether and when you allow your children to see this next picture. So Nathaniel, perhaps we could put it up now. Yeah, you may not want your children to get any ideas from this. Jesus' followers need training. Well, here's a new young teacher, and perhaps this could be their first lesson when they're left on their own. When you begin to train as a teacher and you go on your teaching practice, the first couple of weeks, you might actually just be sitting there in the class, watching the real class teacher doing the lessons. And then you might have a week or two where you're taking the lessons, but the teacher is still in there with you and giving the eye to anybody who looks as if they're going to misbehave. But then you are left on your own, learning to fly, and hopefully and usually the results aren't like this. Well, what's that got to do with the passage that we're looking at today? Well, if you go back to uh, chapter 8 and verse 1, you would read these words. After this, Jesus traveled about from one village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God, and the 12 were with him. See, this is a little bit like the trainee teacher sitting in the back of the class and seeing what was going on. Jesus was going around from one village to another. He was doing the work. He was proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. But the 12 were there with him, and they were watching, and they were learning. But what do we read in our chapter today? We read they've stepped on a step. We read there, when Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. And then in verse 6, so they set out and went from village to village, proclaiming the good news and healing people everywhere. You see, it was no longer them sitting watching Jesus do the work. They were now sent out, and Jesus wasn't actually there with them. They were sent out, and they were actually doing the work. Now, there's some things there which are obviously very, very specific to those first disciples and apostles. The giving of power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases isn't given to all. But we are called on to follow Jesus and to do those things that he was doing. So, why did Jesus do this? Why did Jesus do this? Well, one reason is very simply they could get to more villages that way. Jesus, being incarnate, was limited to space and time. He could only be in one village at a time. By training up the disciples and then sending them out 2 by 2, and a few weeks later we'll read of 72 going out, they could get to far more villages in Galilee and in Israel than by Jesus simply going along with them. So that was one reason. The second reason, I think, why Jesus did this was that Jesus knew that he wasn't going to be with them much longer. Jesus knew that his time on the earth was going to be relatively brief, and within 18 months or so of this, he would have been crucified, raised again from the dead, and then ascended into heaven. And the work then of going out and spreading the message, of spreading the gospel, was going to be in the hands of these 12 men. So they needed training, and they needed given experience and given opportunities to do these things, even though it must have been very frightening at first. And surely there's something that we as a church can learn about that. And what we need to learn from this, surely, is that we also need to train up the next leaders and to give them opportunity. I mentioned Young Life earlier, Joe Bennett, and we were very grateful when our children were at Young Life for the opportunities that they gave them in their teenage years, in their early Christian years, of leading Bible studies, of just planning a program. I thought it was a great experience for them. And we need to be sure that we're doing that as a church as well. One of the thrills for me over the last few weeks while we've been doing these Zoom meetings is to see more and more young people getting involved in our meetings. This morning, we had Philip and Naomi helping lead us in prayer. 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had Isaac Hulse joining his dad in doing the teaching. And we must continue to do this We must continue making sure that the next generation is being trained up. When I was working in schools as a curriculum leader and the timetabler of the school, when the last head I worked with arrived at the school, he had a meeting with me the first week or so, and the very first question he asked of me was this: if you fall under a bus tomorrow, who does my timetable? It was a good question to ask, wasn't it? We need to have people prepared and ready to take over. And not only do we need people prepared and ready and trained to take over, but those of us who are older need also to be willing to give them the opportunity. Yes, mistakes will be made, but people need that in order to learn and to train. And we need at times to be able to step aside and to let others do that. And perhaps as it is his 79th birthday today, I am allowed one quote from Bob Dylan. So he said to people in the times are changing, don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall. So those of us who are that bit older, make sure that we don't do that. So Jesus' followers need training. The second point that we have this morning is that Jesus' followers need to trust God. Jesus' followers need to trust God. In verse 3, we read this. He told them, take nothing for the journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirt. I suspect very often when we go out for a job to do, the night before, we're packing and we're looking to see that we've got everything there. We've got a spare set of clothes in case we spill anything. We've got our laptop there, whatever the job might be that's needed. But Jesus says, no, on this journey, I want you to go with no earthly provisions, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra shirt. Now, children, those of you particularly of school age, on the worksheet that I sent to you, you had a little question, and perhaps we could have the next slide now, Nathaniel. And I was asking you, what kind of fish were these? And I think you had a choice, weren't you? You had 4 choices: tuna, mackerel, shark, or cod. So I wonder, could you just put your hands up when I call that out? How many of you think these fish are tuna? And how many think they're mackerel? How many think they're shark? Be a little worried if I saw many hands up for that one. And how many of you think they are cod? Well, the answer is mackerel. And let me just tell you a little story of an incident where I had to learn to trust God that had something to do with mackerel. I was on a beach mission a good number of years ago, led by a man who was a trainee Methodist minister at the time, Rob Frost. And we were down there in Newquay. And when we arrived on the Saturday, we were all asked just to put what money we had into the faith bucket. We all did that. But by about Thursday, or towards the back end of the week anyway, that faith bucket was looking very empty. And we were wondering how we were going to manage to eat for the last 2 or 3 days. It was suggested that the 3 of us went out fishing. Well, I'll tell you, I'd never been fishing in my life, and I've never been fishing since. And with apologies to people like the Dowlings, who I know love it, to me, fishing is a bit like watching paint dry. But anyway, we got a drop line from Woolworths. That tells you how long ago it was. We went out in a boat, inexperienced fishermen, dropped the line, and we must have just landed over a shoal of mackerel. And these fish were almost jumping to get into our boat. We got to the shore, we took them along to a local shop that sort of was both a butcher and a baker. And we did a bit of bartering and swapped half of our catch for promises of bread rolls and Cornish pasties. And so for the rest of the week, we had plenty to eat, though it was a little bit of a monotonous diet of mackerel, of bread, and of Cornish pasties. And I remember being absolutely thrilled at this, as you can imagine, as a young Christian, seeing how God had remarkably provided for us as we were seeking to follow him. But as I thought of that, I thought for myself and for all of us here, a question, a challenge, certainly I found for me and perhaps for you as well. It is this: when was the last time you were out of your comfort zone in following God? Now, let me say straight away, I'm not talking about putting God to the test. I'm not talking about forcing and making opportunities to push ourselves out of the comfort zone. These disciples of Jesus weren't doing that. Jesus was pointing them out, showing them, this is the next stage for you. This is what I want you to do. And there's no doubt, I'm sure, that when they went the first time, they felt very much out of their comfort zone. So we're not asking you about doing something reckless. But what about when times when Jesus lays something on our hearts or a need occurs there in the church? Have we got into the habit of just sitting back and saying, well, it's not something I feel immediately comfortable to do, therefore I can't do it? Rather than saying, well, Lord, if this is something you want me to do, I can trust that you will provide me with what I need. The second thing I think that verse teaches us is that we need to mistrust anybody who is in it for the money. I suppose the televangelists are a very obvious example of that, but there are examples nearer home. I remember once somebody pointing out to me a particularly lovely village out somewhere in Yorkshire, and pointing out that was where the leaders of a particular church grouping all lived. And it was rather sad, in a sense, to see there they were in these rather luxurious homes. I'm sure I've told you before the illustration of a minister who was offered the opportunity to go to a bigger church that was better paid. And he told his wife about that and said, right, I'm going upstairs now to pray about it to see whether this is the right thing to do. And she said, oh, shall I come upstairs then and pray with you? And he said, no, dear, you just stay downstairs and pack. See, he made the decision already. He was in it for the money. So let's mistrust anybody who's in it for the money. The disciples weren't, were they? They were willing to take risks, to live in a way of poverty in order to do God's work. But there's another side to it as well for us in the church. And this is that we need to make sure that we support God's genuine workers generously. You see, when they went out, Jesus told them, the first house that you stay in, if they welcome you, stay there. Don't move around from house to house. And that would have been quite costly for the household that did that. But they were willing to do it to support God's workers. I know some of you use the Explore notes as we do at home. And a little bit earlier this week, you'll have read 3 John. And in that third letter of John, he praises Gaius for the hospitality he showed. And he says of Christian workers, we ought therefore to show hospitality to such men so that we may work together for the truth. So then let's move on to the third point, that Jesus' followers will face rejection. Jesus prepared them for that. He knew that not every town, not every person would welcome them. And so he said, if people do not welcome you, leave their town and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. Now, I'm sure you know that in Middle East countries, it can get very, very dusty as you walk along, as we can see a picture on the next slide. There's somebody walking along in the dust with their sandals. And Jesus said, and it's still used in the Middle East today as a sign of turning away from people. He says, if people reject you, he says, brush the dust off your feet, off your sandals, as a sign to them. So I think I asked the children to bring along a shoe or a sandal with them this morning. So if any of you have got your shoe or your sandal there with you, pick it up and just brush off with your hand, brush the dust off your sandal and off your feet. Great. So in what ways may we face rejection as followers of Jesus? Well, some of those ways are fairly obvious and fairly severe. One is being put to death. And that's not just something that's in the Bible or in our church history books. This is something that's happening every week to our fellow brothers and sisters around the world. If you were to read evangelicals now any month, you would find examples of this. I looked at the most recent, and there was an example in Myanmar of 21 villages in Christian villages who were bombed, and their village bombed by government jets. So being put to death still happens today. Another way, it's very obvious where Jesus' followers can face rejection, is being thrown out of a family. One of the missionaries we support is in northern Cyprus, and there are at least a couple of their members who, by becoming Christians and following Jesus, have been virtually thrown out of their family, and the rest of their family will have nothing to do with them. That's very hard, isn't it? But there are other ways. We might think, well, those things aren't so likely here. But there are other more subtle ways in which we face rejection. One is being marginalized. Again, you children, you think of your exercise books that you have at school, you know that there's a line down one side of it, and the bit at the side is that part that we call the margin. It's not the main part. And sometimes we can feel that we are marginalized. We're put on one side, we're cold-shouldered. We may be at school or at college or at work, and we feel that anybody can express their views, however radical they may seem. But as a Christian, we sometimes feel if we express our view, that somehow or the other that is not acceptable. Not only can we be put on one side, but we can be considered, we can be despised. It's interesting, even just during my lifetime, that for holding views on such subjects as abortion or sexuality that 30, 40 years ago were the mainstream, that most people in society, not just Christians, would have accepted, that now to hold those views and to express them is to be considered to be a bigot and even immoral. And that's quite tough, isn't it? So when we face rejection, it can be possible to become quite downhearted and make us feel defeated. But shortly, not quite yet, Nathaniel, shortly, we're going to have a look at our fourth point. And I just want the children in particular, but anybody else as well, to join in with this if you want to, is as we put up this next slide, I'd like us all to give a great cheer. Okay, you ready then, Nathaniel? Here it comes. Right, we're giving a great cheer to that. You see there, Jesus' followers are on the winning side. Now, you'll see that photograph is in black and white, And it took me quite a bit of time to find a photograph of my football team being on the winning side. I don't know if I actually managed to get Tommy Hambledon cheering for Newcastle United there, but we shall see. So there we have the great team of 1969, with Joe Harvey, the manager there, Bobby Moncur, the captain, and Pop Robson on the side, as they won the 1969 Intercities Fairs Cup. As I say, I had to look a long way back as a Newcastle United follower, but as a Christian, I'm on the winning side every day. Now you might think, well, where does that come from, the passage? Well, let's look at this last section of the passage. Now, Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that was going on. And he was perplexed because some were saying that John had been raised from the dead, others that Elijah had appeared, and still others that one of the prophets from long ago had come back to life. But Herod said, I beheaded John. Who then is this I hear such things about? And he tried to see him. John the Baptist had confronted Herod about the immorality of his life, made him feel extremely uncomfortable. But Herod thought he had got rid of his problem when he beheaded John the Baptist. But now Jesus appeared. People were perplexed as to who he was, but one thing was for certain, he could give Herod more problems than even John the Baptist had done. And century after century, people have tried to get rid of Jesus and his message, but they've never succeeded. And so after every line, what I'd like us to do after I give the line is for us just to give a yes after each one. So Herod got rid of John the Baptist, but then Jesus appeared. Yes. Jesus was put to death, but he was raised again from the dead. Yes. The church was driven out of Jerusalem, but the message was spread throughout all the world. Yes. Nietzsche said, God is dead, but Nietzsche is dead, and God is very much alive. Yes. China declared itself an atheist state, but there are increasing number of Christians, and by next year there may be more Christians in China than in any other country in the world. Yes. Jesus declared, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Yes. Let me just conclude with a story from somebody who used to be in York. Some of you will know Don Palmer, who was at one time at St. Andrews and then at York Community Church. And I remember Don telling me that when he was a lad, he went into his granddad's house, and on television there was a football match going on, and it was of the team that they both supported. And there was about 15 minutes to go, and their team were 1 goal up. They were either 1-0 or 2-1, but they were 1 goal up. And Don sat there for the last 15 minutes on tenterhooks all the way through, hoping that his team were going to hang on, and hardly been able to watch it when the ball was in their penalty area. Or his granddad seemed to be watching it very, very serenely. At the end of the game, yes, they'd hung on, they'd won. But Don said to his granddad, how did he keep so calm through it all? His granddad just turned to him and he said, you see, Don, lad, I knew the score. The game wasn't live. He'd seen it already. He knew they'd won. And as Christians, we know that through the death of the Lord Jesus Christ, we are on the winning side. And we know he is going to return. And we know that all of the people who've been given to him by the Father from before the beginning of time will be with him forever. So finally, Jesus' followers are on the winning side.